Yes. So I was born with EPP, and you've already heard a little bit about that. I'll tell you about the daily life, though. For most of my life, within 2 minutes of exposure to sunlight, my skin would become hot and itchy. In about 5 minutes, I would feel the burning sensation of a hot iron about 1 inch away from my skin. And in 10 minutes, there would be an explosion of heat and pain. The reactions would be exacerbated by the wind, and if I was in the shade, the sun would be reflected by sand, cement, water. It would bring on an exquisite pain that could make you think you were going to lose your mind. Recovery would take 3 to 5 days, at which point you would be completely out of the sunlight. I would have no tolerance for the sun, and I could not use my hands to even brush my hair or wash a dish. For 40 years, I described myself as being allergic to the sun, which is a really terrible way of describing EPP, but I had no diagnosis and I had no explanation for my symptoms. I was a shadow jumper, running from shady spot to shady spot, huddling under hats, coats, and gloves, wearing long pants and sneakers, especially on the very hottest days of the year. Every decision was dominated by EPP. When I drove to work or the grocery store, I would be shrouded by heavy jean jackets and gloves. I would carefully shade every inch of my skin. A trip into the store would become a journey to hell as I tried to park as close as I could to the door and then dash through the burning sun with my children in tow, hollering at them not to dawdle as mommy's skin was on fire. A business meeting would turn super awkward when somebody would say, hey, let's sit outside in the shade, and I would have to decline or suffer in silence. EPP doesn't just affect the individual patient, it affects the whole family. I have a supportive family who always believed me, and I was surrounded by shade heroes, but I still miss so very much. Trips out to the beach, having to hide inside our vacation rentals, watching my kids' soccer game from the car in the parking lot. Shazia mentioned that my mother saw that TV show. That's how I got myself diagnosed at 40. I did some research, got an order for lab work down the street, and I got my diagnosis. But at that point, having that diagnosis at 40, I learned there was a medication being used successfully in other countries to treat EPP. I had hoped for a treatment for myself someday, and I held tight. In 2015, I wrote my first letter to the FDA requesting that they accelerate approval of that treatment in the U.S., and I didn't think too much about it. I kept to the shadows. I kept working and living with EPP. On April 21st of 2017, though, everything changed and my life turned upside down. That's when I met Kristen. I was at work on a Friday morning, sitting at my computer, and I sensed what I thought was a reaction to sunlight coming on. I was getting tingly, hot, and itchy and uncomfortable. I was shocked to realize that I was indeed having an EPP reaction to the lights in my office. I was terrified. I had to run outside of my place of employment, and I was assaulted in every space of the building. Running outside was no help. The sun was bouncing off the pavement as I cowered in the shade. It felt like hot, boiling oil was pouring on my skin, and my brain was exploding in fear and panic. I called my husband, sobbing, and he told me to come home. A coworker later told me that he saw me enter the building to get my things, and the panic and fear on my face was palpable. It brings me back. It's hard. There's PTSD with the disease. I drove home in tears. My skin was on fire, and there was no place for me to go. My EPP was exacerbated, cause was unknown, and it included now an intense reaction to all visible light. Sunlight, incandescent bulbs, halogen bulbs, LED bulbs, fluorescent lights, computer screens, and cell phones. I just list those all off, so I tried every kind of light bulb. With extreme precautions to avoid all sources of light, I remained in constant pain, and I lived in fear of exposure to any light source. There's no medication for the pain relief. Nights were sleepless. My mental health was suffering. I communicated with porphyria experts. I talked to the FDA, looking for access to the only clinically proven treatment for EPP. It wasn't in the U.S. yet. Dr. Minder in Switzerland agreed to provide treatment with Scenesse, and I had my first implant August 4th, 2017. Having to travel to Zurich, and I couldn't tolerate any light, was one of the most traumatic experiences of my life. I could not be exposed to any light, but I had to enter the airport. I had to go through security. I had to get on the plane. My husband was the caregiver for this trip, and I was heavily sedated in a wheelchair. I was repeatedly, relentlessly exposed to light. After I met with Dr. Minder in Switzerland, I felt hopeful that I would have some relief from my EPP, although she was cautious and suggested I would only get partial results because my case was so extreme. After that implant, I began measuring the results in percentages as the hours passed. It's 2% better. It's 7% better. I kept a journal. Open the blinds 2 inches. It's 10% better. By the time I flew home, it was 20% better. Within 2 weeks of my first implant with Scenesse, I was back to working 40 hours a week with little to no reaction to any light source. I was attending my kids' school conferences and watching my kids play soccer. I traveled to Switzerland 18 times over the next 3 years. That first year, none of the expenses were covered by my health insurance. We took a second mortgage against our house. Friends and family held fundraisers for us. We received gifts large and small to cover the $120,000 in expenses. Even after it was covered by my insurance, we had to pay almost $20,000 up front and submit for reimbursement, plus pay for travel to Switzerland every 8 weeks. All that work for advocating for access to treatment by the porphyria patients led to approval of Scenesse in the U.S. just in the nick of time. I got my last treatment in Switzerland, March 23rd, 2020, days after the world went into COVID lockdown. That's a separate story. Not every patient with EPP responds as well as I have to treatment with Scenesse, and now there are more treatments moving through clinical trials. For me, the blinds are open, the lights are on, and I am living pain-free day after day, night after night. The transformation from being disabled with EPP to being utterly free from pain and free from fear has been life-changing.